welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tylek, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. Today, we're talking about personnel in the prison industry, or the hiring, training, and management of correctional staff. It's a rarely discussed sector, but one that makes up the largest line item in all correctional budgets. But before we get into tonight's program, let's learn 5 quick facts about the personal sector to get us grounded.
Is the abuse people behind bars suffer at the hands of correctional staff a function of who's hired, how they're trained, or agency policies? My name is Bianca Tylek. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and here are 5 things you should know about personnel in the prison industry. Multinational security corporations entered the U.S. prison industry in the 1980s by buying up and arming notorious union-busting private detective agencies. The U.S. security industry generates $9 billion a year off government contracts, though it's unclear how much comes from corrections and immigration detention. Many prisons and jails use hiring agencies to fill medical vacancies with doctors and nurses who couldn't pass background checks in other markets. Private corporations are contracted to both train correctional staff and draft the policies governing their behaviors with the intention of limiting government liability. Major workforce management corporations help prisons and jails track the productivity of incarcerated workers, paid pennies an hour, if anything. Learn more with the curriculum at worthrises.org.
It'd be easy to focus on the mercenaries that corporations like G4S deploy into private prisons or Border Patrol. But tonight we're going to dive into some more nuanced aspects of personnel in the prison industry, and we'll be joined by 4 guests. A little later in the show, we'll be talking to Scott Morris, Danny Robbins, and Insha Rahman. But first, earlier this week, I spoke to Talib Williams, author, journalist, spoken word artist, and co-founder of We Bring Change, a nonprofit organization dedicated to prison abolition. Talib is currently incarcerated in Soledad Correctional Facility in California. Here's a recording of our conversation.
Talib Williams, you are calling us from Soledad Correctional Facility in California. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talib, the story you told in the Worth Rises December report, which you originally published in the San Francisco Bay View, is disturbing. It's a story of violent racist terrorism about a night when Black men in your facility were ripped out of their cells in their sleep. And while extreme, it's probably not that uncommon in some variation for you and others who are incarcerated all over this country. From your perspective, what part of the abuse that you and others suffer daily at the hands of correctional officers is a result of who's hired versus how they're trained?
So I believe entirely it's related. There can't be any disconnect or separation between racism in society and racism in prison, because individuals who work in prison come from society. So a lot of times they try to separate the two, but I would say so. Like maybe like 5 years ago, I got a letter from a friend of mine who was going to college at Humboldt State University, and this was before being woke was a thing, but on her path towards being woke, she was kind of like studying policy and incarceration, mass incarceration specifically, and she had asked me if I believed that prisons were a microcosm of society, and at the time I said, yeah, for sure. But this was like during the beginning of my time being incarcerated, and I had to reflect today on that same question, and I came to the conclusion that although prison is a microcosm of society, it's a microcosm of a specific segment within society, which is that segment that exists between oppressed people and those in authority, particularly police officers. So when you add race into the equation, it becomes even more troubling because those biases don't disappear. They're ingrained in who these individuals are. And if when you're hired to work for an institution, if that's not checked at the gate, it's going to exist throughout the entire institution, in every segment of that institution, from the top down. So from the floor officer working, unlocking the doors, opening the doors, to the captains, lieutenants, sergeants, all the way up to the warden. And it's actually sad when you really start to reflect on what's happening inside these institutions. Like I said in the article, this is a place that thrives in silence and thrives in secrecy. So the more people don't know about what goes on here, the more dangerous it is for those who are incarcerated within institutions such as this.
We were talking about training, right? Hiring of correctional officers and the training of correctional officers. And I think you may know this, but private corporations are running many of the training programs and publishing training materials that are used to train and onboard correctional officers. And in fact, correctional officers often receive a lot more combat training than anything else during their onboarding. De-escalation tactics for things like mental health crises are taught in passing, while the use of force is often practiced for weeks. So there are even correctional training camps that simulate riots and encourage violent responses. In fact, gun manufacturers actually advertise at these camps and will sometimes have booths. How does this training, or this type of training, show up in your life?
In many ways. So, like, the first example that I would give, obviously is the raid. So, if you have a group of individuals...
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
If you have a group of people anywhere that constantly train in a militaristic way, you're building patterns of behavior, knowingly or unknowingly, to where any situation that resembles your training is going to come out, even if it's not basically, even if it's not what it seems not what it appears to be. So, as an example, what happened in July, it would be something that would be unallowed. But just to answer the question again, like that raid is exactly how it shows up in my life.
Yeah, so after that incident and that raid that you're talking about, that you wrote about, the department claimed that all the officers had followed protocol. And in the story you wrote, there was a sentence that read, well, if proper protocol calls for dragging black men by their necks out of bed, who wrote the protocol? And I guess this is another place where often private corporations show up. And I'm not sure if it would surprise you to learn that there are many correctional policies across the country that are actually drafted by private corporations that are hired by both police and correctional agencies to help them restrict their liability when things like that happen.
Right. So yeah, like that's again, that would seem like it would be a conflict of interest. And it's sad that exists in this country, but I think we would have to imagine and try our best to really look at what the problem is and try our best to point out the conflict of interest wherever it shows up, because it seems as if these places run and operate autonomously. And if that continues to happen, then there will be situations like this will continue to happen, you know. And but like I said earlier, I think the way in which prisons operate, they do so purposely in order to keep things silent. So yeah, but it doesn't surprise me, but it is sad. If that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess let me ask you one last question. How do you think, I mean, do we hold these companies accountable in any way for the violence that they are allowing to happen inside of facilities and the ways in which they're essentially giving correctional agencies and in some cases police departments sort of an out? What should folks on the outside do about that?
So demand that there's transparency first and foremost. I think that a lot of people will be surprised what really takes place inside prisons. So you have policies that are set in place that are supposed to protect public safety. And just to give you an example, and the listeners an example of what they mean and how it shows up in here is if I'm using the restroom and I have a window in front of my cell that literally, if you look in, you have a direct view towards the toilet. If I put a window cover up to protect it for some privacy to use the restroom without anybody walking by, mind you, you have women nurses in here. People walk by constantly, so you need obviously privacy to use the restroom. But if I put that window cover up, I'll get a 115, which is a rule infraction violation, and I will get written up, which is basically puts me in a position where if I'm a lifer or if I have to sit in front of a board, now I have to explain why I quote unquote violated the rules. So these policies that are put in place aren't really protecting public safety, but are meant to essentially create an environment where these individuals in here have job security by being able to enforce quote unquote rules and regulations whenever they feel like it. So first and foremost, I would say for people to become aware of what takes place behind the walls of these prisons and hold these people accountable by setting in place fail safes to do that. How that looks, I can't say, but definitely when you have an environment like this where there's no accountability, crime is not necessarily crime, well, actually could call it crime, it's going to run rapid on those who are supposed to keep crime from happening.
Got it. Talib, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. We're sorry you can't be with us live, but we know that the audience will send you their love, and hopefully we will see you home soon.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, and I send mine as well.
To keep up with Talib's work, please visit talibthestudent.com. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is Scott Morris. Scott Morris is an independent journalist based in Oakland who has covered policing, protests, and civil rights for a decade. He has written features for The Appeal, ProPublica, East Bay Express, Berkeley Side, and Oakland Magazine. Most recently, Scott helped launch Open Vallejo, a new nonprofit investigative journalism outlet. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's revisit the issue of correctional policies that Talib raised. In 2019, you wrote a feature in The Appeal about a private corporation named Lexipol, which has drafted policies for over 3,400 police, fire, and correctional departments across the country. To start us off, can you explain why a police department or correctional agency might outsource policy drafting to Lexipol?
Yeah, to start, I mean, it's just a matter of effort. It's easier to just buy a boilerplate policy than to take the time to draft your own. But the policies also have there's an intention of making it difficult to get sued and difficult for officers to be held accountable because, that costs the city money. Every time if there's something in the policy and there's a lawsuit, and they violate the policy, then the lawsuit has a greater chance of success and that'll cost the city more money. So it's in the city's financial interest to make sure that the policies are kind of vague enough so that, just about anything that police officers and correctional officers do won't hold them accountable.
Gotcha. So what's clear is that these policies are not intended to prevent misconduct or save lives, as we might think, but instead they just help agencies avoid liability, as you said. So how does this reality materialize in the policies themselves? What civil rights concerns do they raise? And to add one more layer, I know you've written a lot about these policies in the policing context, but do you think the obscurity of prisons raises any additional concerns?
Yeah, I mean, the policies, a lot of them are dealing with, use of force. And of course, that's going to be common to police, to sheriff's agencies, which run jails, and to correctional officers that run prisons. So, it's if the policies are pretty vague on what force can be used in different circumstances, well, then the officers can use these policies to justify just about anything, and it won't, they won't be a policy violation there. Whereas, if there's very strict policies that have very, intentional policies set forth that say what force can be used under what circumstances, well, that can, a lot of reform advocates say that can save lives, that those policies, if officers are, forced to follow them, that'll make sure that force is not used in the wrong circumstances.
So I find it wildly ironic that police and correctional agencies will go so far to avoid accountability, that they hire corporations, they do all these, sort of take all these tactics, that they're trying to avoid accountability for the harm they inflict as part of a system that they claim is about holding people accountable who cause harm. So are there ways, any examples or ideas of ways in which communities can push back on these policies to drive accountability? And I guess more importantly, can a policy ever really prevent systemic violence?
I don't think a policy can totally prevent systemic violence, but a lot of people think that policies play an important role in kind of limiting that and making sure that violence is only used in under certain circumstances and not all the time, or not excessively. It creates a vehicle to remove problem officers, because if they are found to be in violation of policies, well, they can be terminated. So if there's a violent officer, policies can make sure that officer is not allowed to continue doing his job. And a lot of places are trying to add more community input on policy development. Here in Oakland, we have a police commission that can draft police policies and does draft police policies. San Francisco has a similar mechanism, and other cities are adding that as well. It's something you typically see more in big cities, but there's no reason that anyone can't have some kind of public process for input on police policy development.
Scott, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you at the end of the show.
Thanks.
To learn more about Scott's work, follow him on Twitter at OAKMORR. Next, I want to bring in Danny Robbins. Danny Robbins is an investigative journalist based in Dallas. He was previously a member of the investigative team at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where his reporting on the deaths of women in the Georgia prison system led to numerous reforms and won the Atlanta Press Club's Award of Excellence for Coverage of Civil and Human Rights. Before working in Atlanta, Danny was an investigative reporter for the Associated Press and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Welcome, Danny. Let's shift gears. Hey, let's shift gears here. because we know that officers are not the only staff in prisons and jails. Danny, you spent a few years investigating a really tragic story in Georgia that led to the deaths of at least 9 incarcerated women. The story started when the Georgia DOC contracted a third-party hiring firm to fill a physician vacancy. They hired a doctor who had previously been sanctioned in New York and recently lost a wrongful death suit. Can you explain the role and responsibility of the hiring firm in bringing new medical practitioners into Georgia's prisons, and how this doctor stayed in the system for 9 years after starting in a temporary position?
Well, this is the story of Dr. Yvonne Nazir. It's filled with dysfunction and also tragedy. At least 9 women died during the 9 years, and there have probably been at least 3 more since he left. And the first thing you should start with is his licensing. He was inextricably licensed by the Georgia Medical Board without restriction, even though he was in the midst of probation in New York for 5 malpractice cases in emergency rooms, including a death. He was licensed without restriction. Then he sought a job in the Georgia prison system, and a third-party doctor recruiting firm placed him as the medical director at Pulaski State Prison. Augusta University runs the healthcare in the Georgia prison system, and they contract with these companies to find doctors as temporary or locums tenens physicians. He was placed in this job. That firm did not check his New York license or even with the National Practitioner Database, and the university relied on that incorrectly. They no longer do. And then the third part of this, when they hired him full-time, the statewide medical director knew that he came from New York, but only checked briefly the medical board's order, didn't even look past the first page, and hired him without even questioning him on this. And we know this now, unfortunately, because he ultimately testified in a deposition in a wrongful death suit filed by one of the women who died in Nazir's care.
Wow. So it seems like there was a third-party hiring agency. There was the Georgia Department of Corrections. There was the Georgia Medical Board. There was the university medical system, all involved, and all of them willfully overlooked, looked the other way when there were quite glaring issues in Dr. Nazir's professional history. They were clearly willing to sacrifice the health of incarcerated women, but why? What was it that was more important?
Well, one factor is it's not easy to get doctors to work in the prison system. And you get somebody like Dr. Nazir, unfortunately. The salaries in Georgia at the time for a prison doctor was about $150,000 a year, which is obviously good money, but significantly less than what an internal medicine specialist or a general practitioner would make. And he was willing to work for that, and he was willing to come into the Georgia prison system where the prisons are in isolated locations. But once he became a full-time position, his bosses, who were situated hundreds of miles away, were very enamored with the fact that he was keeping costs down. He was cutting costs. And the way he did it was deny consultations for things like colonoscopies, lung scans, et cetera, for women. That kept costs down. Unfortunately, what it also did, it denied these procedures for women who needed them. And had they gotten them, it would have saved some lives and prolonged others.
Wow. So, I mean, it's the kind of clearest example, right? That in the end, the cost of things sort of always supersedes the care and well-being of people who are incarcerated. And in this case, the number of women died. So what happened to Dr. Nazir, Danny? Was he sanctioned? Was he fired? Did he lose his medical license? Please tell me he's not still practicing.
Well, when the first story started coming out, he was placed on paid leave, and then he was fired. The firing was tied to the fact that he lied on his job application. He submitted a resume that indicated he was working at 3 emergency rooms in the New York City area, when in fact he was unemployed, and it stated that in his own bankruptcy filing. So he's fired, and then they took the university did a broader investigation and found that at least 3 of the deaths that we had reported were below, the treatment was below community standards, and that Nazir ought to be sanctioned by the medical board. So the medical board took up the case, but while they were investigating, his license lapsed. And in Georgia, once the license lapsed, the medical board says no more. So they dropped the investigation. He moved back to New Jersey, where he applied for a medical license. And the last thing I've seen is that license is still pending. But also, it should be noted that the state of Georgia has had to pay out over $2 million in legal settlements to the families of women who have either been disabled or died while in his care.
Yeah, that's interesting. It raises a few questions, right? Was it actually in the end really cheaper for the system? But of course, that's like not what we really want to focus our attention on, right? Whether or not Dr. Nazir saved money for the system or not, but rather, you know, whether or not he served the needs of the women that were in his care. I thought it was interesting, Danny, when we spoke the other day, you also mentioned that Dr. Nazir actually never even moved to Georgia.
That is correct. He stayed at a budget inn in Hawkinsville, Georgia. The way that he worked 4 days a week at 10-hour shifts. So he came in and stayed in the hotel and went home on the weekend. Never got a Georgia driver's license at all. It was.
He was in Georgia for 9 years.
Yes,
working as a doctor
and somebody would pick him up. And at one point, there are 4 women's prisons in Georgia. He was in charge of the medical treatment for 2 of them. And women died in his care under very questionable circumstances at both of those prisons.
One last question for you, Danny. There was a lot of people that fought here. There's no doubt, right? There was, as we had mentioned sort of earlier, and rattled off between the medical board, the University Department of Corrections. But there was also this third-party hiring firm that sort of introduced Dr. Nazir to this entire equation. In large part, if it really wasn't for them, and he may have never been working in the Department of Correction at all. What responsibility do you think that they have in this, and whether they should have been somehow penalized in this whole tragedy?
Well, what I found when I looked into it is a lot of doctors wind up in the Georgia prison system through these firms as locums tenens physicians, and most of them leave, but some of them do stay. And at that time, Augusta University, when they hired physicians, they took the stance, well, they're being vetted by these third-party firms. They never were. And in Nazir's case, he had a Georgia license. That was enough. They never even checked New York. It got worse when he was hired full-time, and they did check New York, but didn't really bother to even read it. But since then, they have changed their policy. After Nazir, they made a number of policy changes, and one of them was they would not rely on these third-party recruiting firms to vet their physicians in the system.
Well, that's a change. Danny, thank you so much for your work on this story. To keep up with Danny's work, follow him on Twitter @RobinsDanny. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Our final guest today is Insha Rahman. Insha is the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice, one of the largest criminal justice organizations in the country. She is a nationally recognized expert on bail in the criminal legal system. Before working at Vera, Insha was a public defender in the Bronx. Insha, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bianca.
So we've heard some really awful stories already about correctional staff, both line staff that are correctional officers, as well as medical staff and other civilian staff. Given that staff is the largest expense line for correctional agencies, it makes sense that staff have an incredible impact on the experience of incarcerated people and their loved ones that are doing time with them. Some have suggested that there are better prison systems in other parts of the world, and that in these systems, there is a stark difference in the makeup of correctional staff, among other things. You've seen some of these systems firsthand. Can you tell us about the differences?
I will talk about what prisons look like in Germany and Norway and some of the stark differences between composition of the corrections personnel who work in prisons and hiring practices, as well as training for staff on the job. But before I talk about that, there's this sort of through line of cheap and affordable and sort of getting the most bang for your buck. And the truth is the American correctional system is not cheap, and it doesn't deliver on anything, certainly not safety, but not also wellness or services or anything that it promises to do. It costs us $80 billion a year just to operate jails and prisons in this country. And it's a terrible return on investment. And so, I mentioned three stark differences between how correction systems in Germany and Norway run versus how they run here. The first one is composition. So here in this country, the vast majority of personnel who work in jails and prisons are security sworn personnel. Literally 3 out of 4 people who work in jails and prisons are there for the explicit purpose of security, oversight, and monitoring. A stark difference in Norway and Germany is the vast majority of personnel are actually hired for what's known as program and professional personnel. So medical staff, counselors, teachers, folks who run programs and services in the jails and prisons, not folks who are there simply to administer punishment, which is what security and oversight and monitoring is. Here in this country, the best estimate we have is only 6% of personnel in jails and prisons are there for programs, services, treatment, care. That's a really stark difference. And we're making a deliberate choice to hire in jails and prisons for security and oversight and monitoring and punishment, not to actually provide care and services and support to people who are incarcerated. That's a distinct choice we make, and we pay for it in the violence and the harm that we've heard from the other panelists. The second choice is in hiring. And so I think it's really telling to just look at a job description for how we hire for corrections personnel here in this country. Literally, there are words like, your job is to secure the facility and safety of inmates. Your job is to inspect areas. Your job is to monitor activities, right? All of that suggests a sense of threat and sort of violence that's lurking, and your job is to literally tamp down on that. A job description in a Norwegian prison is things like, your job is to facilitate programming, to build relationships with people in your custody and care, to maintain family connections for people who are incarcerated. I mean, just even that word choice and what it signals to the folks who are, to applicants, it's really significant, right? Again, those are choices that we're making about who we want to come into jails and prisons and be responsible for the operations of them. And the third is training. In this country, on average, corrections personnel get anywhere from 6 weeks to at most 6 months of training. And the vast majority of that training curriculum is, again, about securing sort of safety and looking out for, potential sort of riots and things like that. It's all geared towards sort of, tamping down on a potential threat. And when you are trained to think that everything is a threat, everything becomes one, even though it's not, right? And in Norway, the training for new staff is actually 2 years. And that training consists primarily of counseling classes, behavioral sciences, and de-escalation. How do you actually make sure that people in the environment of a jail and a prison is far more peaceful and oriented towards care than it is punishment and control? Those are stark differences. They're choices that we make. And so there's a real question about, are those better or not? Is there ever any way to do incarceration humanely? But there's certainly choices we can make to not do it the way that we do in this country.
Oh, there's a lot there, from the composition to the training, to the compensation, to the hiring, as you noted. So your point about reimagining the composition of correctional staff to reflect the needs of those the system swallows up echoes something we heard in week 1 when we discussed architecture and construction and the need to build an infrastructure that serves our communities rather than prisons and jails. But it begs the question, does it make any sense to be hiring these different positions, folks into these different positions, into prisons and jails, when we know that you can't get care in a cage. Like, what are your thoughts, Insha?
In this country, we have over 2 million people incarcerated today. If we were to even incarcerate at the rate of every other nation in the world, we would have no more than 360,000 people behind bars. And so that means in this country, our addiction to mass punishment and mass incarceration, it's literally at a rate of over 6 times what any of our peer countries do. And that's a really important place to start, because no, we can't invest in more programs and medical care and mental health care in jails and prisons until we actually invest in decarceration, having far fewer people behind bars, because there is no providing care or doing things better behind bars when we have the system of mass punishment that we have. So decarceration is actually the very first step that we have to take. And we know this. We know that we're actually safer, our communities are safer when we have fewer people behind bars, because the experience of incarceration itself, it rips families and communities apart, and it follows people for the rest of their lives. And that in and of itself causes more harm than good. The second is that we need to invest and spend those dollars. Imagine what $80 billion that we spend on corrections this year. Imagine what that could deliver in our communities when it comes to medical and mental health care, housing, treatment, education, green space, food. The list goes on. Again, we know this. This investing in community-based care is what gives us healthy, safe communities, not more jails and prisons. So the point is, we have made a choice to spend our money from federal dollars, and we have a new administration. We have an opportunity to push for federal investment in our communities, not in more jail construction or prison construction. We also have the choice at the local level. Counties run jails, states run prison systems, to make different choices about where our public dollars go.
Insha, thank you. To learn more about Insha's work, visit vera.org. If you haven't yet, now's the time to drop your questions into the chat on YouTube and Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag #punishmentprofit. But before we jump into Q&A, here are my takeaways from this week's discussion about personnel. Every week we hear about a different form of violence exacted by the system, and there's something particularly visceral about the type of violence we talked about today. Perhaps it's because it's the type of violence that we best understand. Interpersonal physical violence. Whether it comes in the form of a swinging baton or medical malpractice, the cuts, bruises, and fractures are palpable. See, in the short term, violence is cheap. It's cheaper to hire and train officers to beat people into obedience than it is to hire and train counselors to listen and understand people. But the social cost in the long run is heavy. Not just on those with scars, but also on those creating them. Turnover among correctional staff is high. The environment is taxing, and the violence often travels from inside prison walls into the rural homes of prison towns. These are not good jobs, and yet people are fighting for them. I was inspired by a conversation that I had the honor of participating in this weekend, hosted by a number of formerly incarcerated people, about the difference between reform and abolition, and whether the two could coexist. I shared the thought leadership of longtime prison abolitionists who have described the difference between reform and abolition as a matter of how far you are interested in going, and thus that they can coexist only insofar as a reform does not interfere with the abolition journey. So in the context of correctional staff, what is the prison abolitionist stance that also considers the grave violence people behind bars are suffering today? It's definitely not more officers or even better trained ones, as we know from the movement to defund police. It's not policies or even oversight commissions that would suggest the system has some version that isn't violent. But it could be removing officers in substantial numbers from existing facilities and positions and replacing them with medical, mental health, counseling, and program staff. It may help illustrate that we don't need security and surveillance, but rather healing and opportunity. It would allow practitioners to explain that, as Unisys Hernandez said a few weeks back, you can't get well in a cell. And that may take us to a difficult place. organizing with labor to create non-correctional jobs. But no one said this work is easy. So now let's bring back all of our guests to answer some of your questions. So thank you, everyone. Welcome back up. And I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we have coming in. Victoria Scott, one of our curriculum fellows, pops in asking, how can we support our incarcerated siblings when it comes to the violence they're experiencing under a correctional policy? Does that look like drafting local petitions or other features? Scott, I'm going to throw that one to you.
I guess the question is how to support kind of new policies that would, do better for the people that are incarcerated. And, I think that petition is part of that. It would depend on the state and the municipality and kind of what the local laws are. So I can't speak to a lot of circumstances. I know that in Oakland, when they instituted a police commission that could draft policies, it was pressure on the city council after a series of police scandals that led them to draft a new ordinance that would create the police commission, but that also required a ballot initiative that the whole city had to vote on that. Here it passed with 80%. People were ready for that, so that's the kind of steps it took here. I think that would be the same in a lot of places, but it kind of depends, and it's just to getting involved in local government and finding out how that works is kind of the first step.
So I love that she brought up local government, because that brings us to the second question. I think, Insha, I might let you start in this next one, but Scott, I'm sure you might have some more to lean in, because it's another question about policy, and one in particular about Lexipol. Kara Kennard asks and says, I sit on the Public Safety Committee for my small rural county in Wisconsin. We just had policy changes come up, and I heard about Lexipol for the first time. Are there questions that I can ask during committee meetings regarding policies and personnel in our jails? And is there anything else that I should be suggesting?
So I'll start with saying that, there are companies that draft policies that on their face seem fine, but what really matters is how are the policies being implemented? How are they being followed? How is it being documented, sort of what the impact is? And so the question is certainly about the policies themselves. What are we paying for them as a county government? Because they don't come free. And we know that there, in addition to Lexipol, are other corporations that create these policies that sell them basically off the shelf to corrections agencies. And so to find out how much are we paying for it, to actually ask to see the policies. Some state prison systems and local jails post them online, but the majority don't. You are entitled to see that as a community member. And if the county won't turn that over, you can either get it under Freedom of Information Law or public records access, whatever the local sort of mechanism is for sunshine. And then to push to say, so what are the numbers? We want to know how many use of force incidents were there, how many complaints were filed for medical maltreatment or negligence, like just finding out what's actually happening in the local jail or prison, because the hardest thing is we don't know, other than from the experiences and stories of people who are directly impacted, incarcerated, their families. It's hard to get the numbers. And so demand those, ask for them, ask for hearings, find the city council or county legislator who is on your side, and really bring transparency to this issue, because the policies themselves are just the start. It's really what's happening behind bars that matters. And community members and engaged people can really help to change and sort of shine a light on the abuses that we know are happening.
I'm gonna to add one thing that you can ask for too, which is settlement figures. I think that there are, in addition to many things Insha just mentioned, which I think is really important, transparency. Much of the reason that any of this exists, right, is obscurity. And the fact that, what happens in prisons and jails is really a black box in so many different ways. And then on top of that, we have policies that eliminate any level of liability. And so really asking for data and write a report exposing that data, putting that data out is important. But I think one of the critical factors and figures that people are always interested in is costs, right? And it was mentioned sort of earlier, Danny talked about this idea of how much money in settlements they ended up paying there down in Georgia. And so that's actually a consistent figure in many different places. It happens. There's been reports around settlements around policing. There also should be a lot of figures around settlements and numbers around that for folks who are incarcerated. And actually, Danny, I'll pass it to you for a second. Is there anything else that you think, you did this incredible work investigating in Georgia, what was going on there and eventually bringing that to light, which, while didn't get all of the things you might want to get as it pertains to sanctions for Dr. Nazir or any of the other parties who were involved, it was something that did change as a result. And so, what do you think would be worthwhile to elevate and to expose? What could somebody who sits on a county council, like Vera does, ask for?
Well, transparency is not what the Georgia Department of Corrections lives by. But there are records. If you know where to look, you can get incident reports. If you know somebody harmed in an incident in a prison or involving a correctional officer or medical, usually there's an incident report. They're very bare bones. You could get, there's standard operating procedures are all available. And then sometimes if you really dig beneath the surface, what we did early on, every time an ambulance takes someone from a prison, there would be a record of it. We got those records and we're able to track what happened to those people. You've sometimes got to be creative using your state Open Records Act because prisons generally do pull in their horns on these things.
Thank you. And I think I have just one more thing. As somebody who is in an elected position, presumably, or sits on a county council board, you can also go to the prison or go to your jail in your community. It's an important piece is proximity, is actually just walking into these facilities because the public can't walk in and the public can't actually see what's going on. So I'm going to jump to the next question from Jerry Weinstein. Question is, what reforms should people be at this point sort of advancing that don't upend abolition? And, as this says sort of in my comments, abolition being the final goal, what can we be doing now around correctional staff that is in line with that? And, I sort of made some comments and started us off, and hopefully perhaps there's others who have thoughts. But I think in large part, right, it's not hiring more officers, and it's not, believing that somehow we're going to make the system less violent in the way that it is and is designed now, but taking officers out of our facilities and replacing them with people who can provide care in a way that allows for the entire system to at some point crumble as it is and transition. Insha, Scott, Danny, is there anything that you would love to see happen in facilities now?
So this isn't in facilities, but I think it changes the ultimate dynamic in terms of funding for them. In Los Angeles County, the voters just passed an act called Measure J, which takes at least 10% of the sheriff's budget and allocates that money to community-based alternatives to incarceration, treatment, and care. And so these budgets are moral documents. They reflect our priorities and our values. And Budgets are coming up for most counties. It's, either in the spring, an April 1 budget, or in the fall, October 1. For many cities, it's July 1. Right now is budget season, and a push to actually change where dollars are going, so that they're not going to jails, they're not going to prisons, they're actually being allocated for communities. That's actually something counties have started to do, and it's a very concrete way of changing the dynamic and the power that jails and prisons have held over our communities.
Scott, I'm gonna kick something to you, because you said earlier, we were just talking about public acts for information, public records requests, right? You have said to us before, we were talking, that you are a self-proclaimed public records nerd. Are there things that people should really know about their local facilities as it pertains to these policies or correctional staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Insha was absolutely right, that it's important about how the policies are applied, how they're being enforced. And, that's something that is available in a lot of states. And it's something like in California, we only recently got this power a couple of years ago, but it's been really important that we can now see not all police personnel records, but, in cases of force that leads to death or great bodily injury, now those records have to be released. And so you can see if the officer was fired, you can kind of get their analysis of the circumstances and, make sure through that documentation that they're applying the policy correctly. Because if there is a policy on the books that says they shouldn't do a certain thing, but they say, well, he's cleared anyway, that's something that's important to know. It's important to know what they're doing with that. And so those public records have been crucial for accountability.
Thank you so much, Scott. Okay, so I think we're all wrapped up for today. We've answered most of your questions. I want to thank our guests so much for joining us tonight. Talib, who is with us by recording, Scott, Danny, and Insha. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, to talk about programs and labor. For those who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask more questions or share your reflections, join me and Brianna Gibson, Director of Campaigns at Worth Rises, as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me at Bianca Tylek to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about our work at Worth Rises, please check us out at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tylek. Good night.